I was going to be drinking Woodbridge Chardonnay for this video, but I must have broken my corkscrew last time I put it in the drawer.
I did not intentionally do this.
It was not intentional. So instead, let me set this down. It's heavy. Really, if you haven't gone and just picked one of those up and held it, I think it gives you an idea of just how intoxicated Sarah was. So instead, I have some Dr. Pepper that has had some things added to it. And if that runs out, I guess I just have to drink water with my hands. All right. Now, I do want to begin by thanking everyone who has subscribed during this. It's crazy. We've almost reached 20,000 subscribers. And I also want to make sure I give a big thanks to everyone who has decided to support me through the 99-cent membership on YouTube or the Buy Me a Coffee, which I have linked in the pinned comments if anyone would like to do that. And with that being said, we have to discuss the sentencing of Sarah Boone, and to do that, I feel I need to start with the documents filed today on the day of sentencing. Now, the psych eval is private, but the others are not, so we can read these, we can talk about it. This is the defendant's motion for downward departure. Comes now the defendant, Sarah Boone, by and through counsel, and pursuant to Florida statutes 9210026, files this motion for downward departure, stating in support thereof the following. The defendant was found guilty of the charge of second-degree murder on October 25th, 2024. The instant motion is filed pursuant to Florida statutes 9210026, which lists statutory reasons to depart beneath statutory guidelines. The defendant asserts that she is eligible for a downward departure under 9210026 by the following grounds. Under 9210026-2C, the capacity of the defendant to appreciate the criminal nature of her actions and to conform said actions to the requirements of law was substantially impaired. Under 9210026-2D, the defendant requires specialized treatment for a mental disorder that is not related to substance abuse or addiction, as is amenable to treatment. The defendant acted under extreme duress per 9210026-2G, and the offense was committed in an unsophisticated manner, which was isolated and for which the defendant has shown remorse. So remorse is factored in for the downward departure. Remember that. You're going to want to remember that. Trust me, we are in for a roller coaster today. Now, this is the state's response to the defendant's motion for a new trial. Now, I already read the motion for a new trial, and then I went through some of the case law and was like, this doesn't actually make any sense. And that's basically what the state did, I think. I just kind of glanced at it. I was more focused on the trial itself. And this is all being recorded, by the way. I'm going to try to do it in one video, one take, all recorded literally minutes after the feed to the courtroom was cut. Comes now the state of Florida by and through the undersigned assistant state attorney states and alleges as follows. Ground 1, the court ruling defendant not entitled to court-appointed counsel. This ground is based upon things that occurred well before the trial began and does not appear to be a basis for the court to grant a motion for a new trial under Florida Rule of Criminal Procedure 3.600. The court's decision on this ground is well supported by the facts and law outlined in the court's 16-page order dated June 28, 2024. The court should not grant a new trial based upon this ground. Ground 2. Court denying defendant's motions to continue. This ground is based upon things that occurred before the trial began and does not appear to be a basis for the court to grant a motion for a new trial under Florida Rule of Criminal Procedure 3.600. The defendant is overstating the holdings of the cases she cited. Barroso v. State, McKenzie v. State, Jones v. State, Deal v. State. The court shall not deprive a defendant of his or her right to counsel of their own choice. Failure of a trial court to grant a continuance will result in a new trial. Should the court deny said motion for a continuance by new counsel is not the holding of these cases. So, simply put, not the right case law. A defendant's right to counsel of his or her own choice is not absolute, and a court's consideration of any continuance should balance the defendant's right with consideration of the impact on the administration of justice. Any denial of a continuance to obtain new counsel must be based upon an adequate inquiry into the circumstances with findings to assure the defendant's constitutional rights were not being deprived. The court's 16-page order dated June 28, 2024, adequately addresses the circumstances of the defendant's forfeiture of her right to counsel and the setting of a trial date of October 7, 2024, 56 months after she was arrested for this crime. The court did not abuse its discretion by denying a continuance in this matter. The case was over 4.5 years old because of the defendant's issues with multiple prior attorneys, issues created by her behavior. The underlying work on the defense of self-defense and battered spouse syndrome to be used in support of a claim of self-defense had been done by prior counsels. Much of the records disclosed to the state in October 24th, 2024 have been acquired years ago by prior counsels via subpoena and provided to private investigator Billy Lane. I am sad we never got to meet Billy. He was mentioned throughout this. The Florida Supreme Court requires only 30 days notice prior to trial for a defendant to rely upon battered spouse evidence. In this circumstance, with the expert already working on the defendant's case for years and relying upon records the defendant had in her possession for years, it was the state that had only 30 days to handle this evidence after prior counsel had indicated it would not be filing a notice of intent to rely on battered spouse syndrome evidence. While it did take time to review the entirety of the defendant's phone extraction, the state was able to do so in the same time frame and narrow it down to 167 pages of PDF timeline and 213 photos video. The phone extraction had been provided years ago to the defendant's prior counsel. It was again provided to the defendant while she was pro se. The 911 calls and body-worn camera footage from prior incidents took approximately half a day to review, and that was accomplished after it was learned on October 1st, 2024, during her deposition, that Dr. Julie Harper relied on them. These were provided to the defense on October 4th, 2024. There was an entire week of no action taken by the court between October 7th, 2024 and October 14th, 2024 because of Hurricane Milton. That in the prior 5 weeks was more than sufficient for a team of 4 attorneys and a trial consultant to review the material if the undersigned could. The court should not grant a new trial based upon this ground. Homicide survivor outburst during presentation of evidence. During the publishing of the exhibit, which contained IMG 0162 MOV, apparently a single family member of the homicide survivors had an emotional reaction and left the courtroom. The undersigned's back was turned and did not witness this. The family member did not return for the duration of the evidence presentation. It cannot be said that this nonverbal, single emotional outburst was so prejudicial as to viviate the entire trial. Talley v. State. Thompson v. State. The trial court's findings on this situation are subject to the abuse of discretion standard, and the court did not abuse its discretion. The undersigned's recollection is that a sidebar there was no request for a curative instruction, but rather a request to excuse the jury. The jury was excused, and the member of the victim's family had either excused herself or then excused herself. And the allegation was then made this was intentionally staged by the state. It was neither intentional nor is it uncommon that a homicide survivor who has a right to be in the courtroom pursuant to Article 1, Section 16 of the Florida Constitution was mistaken in his or her belief about his or her ability to not become emotional during a trial. Nebergale v. State is distinguishable. There, the victim deliberately testified about DNA evidence on her buttocks belonging to the defendant, while in fact it was not the conclusion of the DNA analyst, whose findings were inconclusive as to the identity of the evidence found on the victim's buttocks. Collin v. State is also distinguishable as it involves a mother of a sexual battery victim apparently needlessly being shown a picture of her daughter's vagina and throwing up in a trash can in the presence of the jury. There, a mistrial should have been granted. Smith v. State involved a case where the medical examiner took a breath while testifying to the injuries of the decedent, had sustained, and asked for a break. No error was found in the trial's decision to not grant a mistrial. The state understands the court's ruling at trial on the matter of whether Dr. Warner's opinion of the inapplicability of battered spouse syndrome evidence as a concept was a discovery violation and is not revisiting it for that purpose. Rather, the defendant has included this in her motion for a new trial, so the state will readdress it. The state is not required to disclose unrecorded oral statements, unless it materially alters a prior written or recorded statement previously provided by the state to the defendant. The state deposed the defense expert, Dr. Julie Harper, as soon as possible after she was disclosed, This deposition occurred on October 1st, 2024. The very next day, Dr. Warner evaluated the defendant at the Orange County Jail at noon on October 2nd, 2024. Given that trial was set to begin on October 7th, 2024, this was less than ideal for the state. The state was not provided the materials that Dr. Harper had relied on at that time, although the defendant acquired much of them years earlier. Dr. Harper's deposition has not been transcribed yet for Dr. Warner's review prior to the evaluation. The second defense expert, Michael Brannon, had not been deposed yet. After the defendant, in most material aspects, repeated her statement she made to Dr. Julie Harper that she zipped the victim in the suitcase, they had both initially thought it was funny, but she became angry after the victim said he could not breathe, so she became violent with the victim and ultimately left him in there despite him stating he could not breathe and demonstrating his inability to get himself out of the predicament. It was Dr. Warner's conclusion that battered spouse syndrome evidence would not be applicable. Forgot what Dr. Pepper tastes like with things in it. Immediately after the evaluation on October 2nd, 2024, both parties and the defendant went to court to argue defendant's motion to suppress. On October 3rd, 2024, the state began reviewing the prior interaction with law enforcement that Dr. Harper said she had relied upon during her deposition on October 1st, 2024, and arranged for body-worn camera and 911 calls to be provided to the defense by ASA Dave Cacciatore on October 4th, 2024, while the undersigned was in Osceola County, handling a placement hearing on a not guilty by reason of insanity first-degree murder case. Later on October 3rd, 2024, the undersigned took the deposition of the second battered spouse syndrome expert listed by the defendant, Dr. Michael Brannon, on October 4th, 2024. Immediately after concluding the insanity placement hearing in the morning, the defense team took the deposition of Dr. Warner. Mr. Owens pressed Dr. Warner for any other opinions she may have had, and Dr. Warner insisted on being asked specific questions. This is not a discovery violation nor the creation of a prior inconsistent statement. The victim's failure to mention the two incidents in response to defense counsel's open-ended deposition questions did not amount to a material change in testimony from the videotaped interview with Detective Martin, Detective Martin's report, or the victim's deposition. Because the victim's unrecorded statement did not materially change her previous testimony, the trial court ended the inquiry and properly concluded the state was not required to produce a statement to Iglomari. This is indistinguishable from this case. Furthermore, the defendant was repeatedly placed on notice that the state did not believe as a matter of law that her statements taken in the light most favorable to her amounted to self-defense under Florida law. The decision was held immediately following Dr. Warner's evaluation between the state and defendant's lead counsel to this effect. When defendant lead counsel expressed he believed the state would be lowering its offer of 15 years in the Department of Corrections because of what we had all just witnessed the defendant say. So let's repeat that here. State and defendant's lead counsel to this effect, when defendant's lead counsel, that'd be James Owens, expressed that he believed the state should be lowering its offer of 15 years in the Department of Corrections because of what we had just witnessed the defendant say. So Owens thought that they were actually going to give her less than 15 years as an offer. The state viewed the evaluation very differently and let defendant's lead counsel know why. Further litigation ensued immediately after on the defendant's motion to suppress statements. The defendant in her motion states the witness had formed a new opinion relating to whether the defendant perceived an imminent threat at the time of the offense. The issue was discussed extensively in the expert witness's deposition taken on October 4th, 2024. The word imminent does not appear in the entire 87-page deposition. It was not discussed, but the defendant asked on 78 of Dr. Warner's deposition, according to Dr. Warner, was, and she said, I saw him in the suitcase, I zipped him up, and we were laughing. She said then he couldn't breathe, and I remember feeling I couldn't breathe when he was choking me or sodomizing, and I was angry, and I shook the suitcase. I lost control of the suitcase, and it flipped. Because she was never questioned on that opinion, there were no inconsistent statements to impeach Dr. Warner with. Hypothetically, if the defendant had gotten Dr. Warner's opinion on the matter during the deposition, the state fails to see what the defendant could really do about it other than disagree with it, because Dr. Warner's opinion did not violate Florida Statute 90703. No more than when Dr. Harper rendered the opposite opinion. It was not an opinion on whether the defendant was guilty or not guilty, not even an opinion about whether the defendant used a justifiable use of deadly or non-deadly force. The opinion was about the applicability of battered spouse syndrome as a concept, given what the defendant had told her in the evaluation and because of what the defendant stated in the above paragraph. It was inapplicable even if the defendant suffered from battered spouse syndrome. It was no different than Dr. Harper stating the defendant met the criteria for battered spouse syndrome. the defendant telling her she was in imminent fear at the time the defendant left the victim's shut in the suitcase. Experts can testify that a victim's injuries were consistent with forced sexual intercourse, citing blah blah. Experts also routinely testified about the applicability of the insanity defense to a defendant, routinely called to testify regarding the defense insanity and precisely in these terms. Medical examiners routinely, in this case, testify to the cause of death and does not invade the providence of the jury. It is inappropriate the medical examiner's testimony contradicts the defense theory of the case. This is what happened here. Dr. Werner disagreed with the defendant. Because the defendant was examined by her own expert, Dr. Julie Harper, complied with Rule 3.216E and F, and was examined by Dr. Werner, both experts were allowed to speak on the applicability of battered spouse syndrome regarding the facts of the case, State v. Hickson. The relevance of Dr. Werner not listening to the testimony of Dr. Michael Brandon and Dr. Julie Harper is lost upon the state. Ultimately, regardless of what all three doctors in this case testified to, the crux of the entire case was that accepting the defendant's trial testimony, which was largely consistent with her statements to Drs. Harper and Werner, she failed to comply with Florida Statute 776041. And in fact, escaped having the forced felony instruction read because of a statute of limitations technicality, a point which opposing counsel agreed with at the charge conference. This argument was permissible regardless of whether Dr. Werner testified or not. As a remedy, the court allowed the defendant to question Dr. Werner about opinions she was not asked by the state to give the jury, specifically whether the defendant suffered from any disorders recognized by the DSM-5 TR or met the criteria for battered spouse. She gave the following answer to the following questions during her deposition, page 37 through 38. Okay, alright, as it relates to Sarah Boone, do you have any diagnosis as it relates to her? No, she told me she was previously diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. That would be in there. That would be in there. She's been prescribed an anxiolytic for the help with her treatment for symptoms, whether it's generalized anxiety disorder versus adjustment disorder. Her being in the facility is questionable for me in all honesty, but I haven't had time to go through everything thoroughly since I just saw her 2 days ago and process everything. In all honesty, I think she also has narcissistic personality traits, was evident in the evaluation, and those would be my two major diagnoses. Page 46. But you don't believe she suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder in your opinion? No, I would have to look back through my notes to see if she fully met that criteria. Is it your opinion that Sarah Boone does not suffer from battered spouse syndrome? No. Again, I would have to go through my notes to fully formulate an opinion on that, but I think she certainly was involved in a violent relationship. But you haven't formed... Excuse me. I think I might be talking too fast. I see why she needed the Dr. Pepper. No, again, I would have to go through my notes. But you haven't formed an opinion one way or another about whether Sarah Boone suffered from battered spouse syndrome. I think I want to go through to make sure. I believe there's a lot of violence in her relationship. She described being threatened. She talked about it, different kind of violent cycle, different aspects of it. So most likely she does. I don't have an issue with that. At the trial, the defendant was permitted to explore Dr. Werner's opinions on these matters. The defendant was allowed without objection to bolster Dr. Harper's testimony by reciting passages from Dr. Lenore Walker's treatise on battered woman syndrome. Experts cannot, on direct examination, bolster their testimony by testifying that a treatise agrees with their opinion. This was accomplished by asking if Dr. Harper recognized the book as authoritative, then reading quotes from it. Likewise, without objection, the defendant cross-examined Dr. Werner with quotes from this treatise, with neither her nor the court recognizing the publication as authoritative. Examination of an expert with a treatise is only permissible in cross-examination if the expert or court recognizes the publication as an authoritative treatise. For the above stated reason, the court should deny the request for a new trial on these grounds. We're getting close to the bottom of this, and we'll get into the actual trial. Ground 5, alleged prosecutorial misconduct, essentially making a second closing argument instead of a rebuttal argument. The defendant, much like her motion to suppress statements, cited no authority to support this ground being improper or the grounds for a new trial. This, of course, is no bar to her again alleging prosecutorial misconduct. The proper limit of rebuttal is a reply to which is brought out to the defendant's closing argument. The state strategically broke up its closing argument. The first argument was nearly entirely devoted to why the defendant was guilty of second-degree murder. Obviously, there is some inevitable crossing into why it was not justified and why the defendant lacked credibility, but that was largely left for rebuttal. The defendant's nearly 2-hour-long closing argument centered on why she met the criteria for battered spouse. It touched upon why this made it objectively reasonable for her to fear imminent harm or death if the victim escaped the suitcase, but failed to address the applicability of Florida Statute 776041 to the facts, and the facts were that she left the victim in the suitcase after he said he could not breathe and have to be let out, and she could make him feel how he made her feel in the past, and she could say whatever she wanted to him, and he had to listen to her. It was a completely fair rebuttal to distinguish the difference between a defendant's objective belief that something is necessary versus objectively reasonable for a cautious and prudent person in her circumstances. Likewise, it was fair to attack her credibility as a witness, as that was the foundation of her defense, to point out that even the defendant's arguments were accepted. She failed to comply with Florida Statute 776.041. Conclusion: there is no right to jury nullification. The defendant was placed on notice several times that her version of events did not amount to a justifiable use of force under the law. Basically, the state's saying, we told her this wasn't going to work. State's motion, and they list off all the times they've told her that. No version of the defendant's events amounted to justifiable use of force due to her only saying that she became afraid after she had become angry and aggressed the victim by choosing to not let him out of the suitcase because he made her feel angry when he said he could not breathe. She was going to make him feel like he had made her in the past. She was going to say what she wanted him to say while he was a captive audience. She admitted to what Florida statute describes as the forcible felony of aggravated assault. Florida Statute 776.08 and 784.021, she was allowed her 10 days in court to ask for a jury nullification with past incidents of violence committed by the victim. The court did not grant her a new trial. Give me 1 second here. That was a lot, but I felt I should read it because it wasn't read in court. Now, I want to be clear. This is going to be worse than you can imagine. During this appearance, I'm going to be blatantly honest. I laughed. I cried. And I became extremely, extremely angry. And you're probably going to do the same. I will say, I'm going to be reading my transcripts for the first 2 parts, but the anger, I'm going to make sure you get angry. I'm going to make sure of it, because we are going to listen to the audio of Sarah Boone in court. I'm not going to transcribe her, whatever you want to call it. It's worse than you could have dreamed. I could have dreamed. James Owens looked angry, and it all makes sense. She took her moment to attack not only George, but the Torres family. And with that being said, I'm going to begin my coverage of what happened in that courtroom. Sarah Boone walks to her seat in chains, wearing jail clothes, and turns to the gallery, smiling. On the opposite side of the gallery from where she's looking is George's family. I heard Sarah ask the team, "Is Amanda here?" I don't know who that is. Someone in the courtroom said that Sarah also said, "I love you guys," to someone in the audience while smiling. My guess, hindsight, is maybe that was her witnesses. Sarah keeps looking behind her and smiling. James Owens even turns around, not smiling. To me, it seemed like he was trying to figure out what was going on. Sarah, I can't imagine, is happy because the clothing she is wearing is extremely faded. You can barely see the words. Owens seems to be trying to instruct her at the last minute, while Sarah looks through paperwork. I for sure heard Owens tell her 20 years. To me, Owens looks upset and annoyed. I can only imagine what Sarah has been saying to him every chance she could get since the conviction. The judge was late, which was a big surprise to me, but he must have been checking over case law before the final moments in the documents. That will be verified later. Only Owens is there. The other lawyers did not come. They were late to review the documents, including the psych eval that we do not get to see. Motion for a new trial and state's response first. Motion for a new trial is denied. So we went through that. That was denied. But I feel it's worth it to hear how the state broke it down. Now they are proceeding to sentencing. James Owens says he has 4 witnesses. 1 will testify by Zoom, and their expert and Sarah herself. I want to begin apologizing for any names I get wrong. These are not exact transcripts, and I urge you to watch them yourself if you have the time, if you can handle it, because it will be hard, possibly from my reading, They are heartbreaking, especially from the Torres family, but I'm going to do what I can. State goes first with the impact statement and wants to have Anna Torres, who will appear virtually, but she isn't in the lobby. They bring up instead Blanca Torres. She just wanted to tell Sarah Boone she doesn't hate her for what she did. This is George's mother. She will always remember that evening when that lady came to her door and knocked on her door, asked her for her name, and said, "Can I come in?" She told her to sit down. She never thought that it would be her son. She said her son was dead. Since that day, I can't sleep. It is hard for me to remember that moment. My son is not here no more. She not only killed my son, she killed a father, a brother, and uncle. It's been hard on my family because all the brothers were always together, but it's not like that. Something real love is missing. Sometimes when I look out the window, I wait for him to come and say, "Mom, I love you." She misses those moments. The last time she talked to him was 12 o'clock January New Year's. He woke her up and said, "Mom, I love you. Happy New Year's." She loves her son. She misses him. Her family misses him. She isn't going to be blessed like me because I had my son. I raised him, his children. She isn't going to be able to have that. He wasn't perfect, but he was a good son. Thank you. Victoria Torres is up next. George was her brother. Her family has experienced 2 horrifying tragedies. Now, there's another case involving George's brother, or Victoria's brother. I'm assuming it's brother to both. We'll get a little more of that later, I believe, in the part that I'm going to be playing the audio of. George deserved justice. As far as my other brother and Sarah, they deserve to rot in jail. Sarah has caused a lifetime of pain and horrible images, a lifetime of hearing my brother George plead for his life. This is just this moment for all of you. For me and my family, it is forever. I want you to remember this part. I want you to keep this in your head. If nothing else is in your head for the rest of this, remember, this is just the moment for all of you. For me and my family, it is forever. I want you to remember that because Sarah is going to use that later. Such a simple thing as using a suitcase is so triggering. I try not to close it all the way and leave at least 2 or 3 inches, and it might sound crazy, but it helps me. She really has flipped my family's life upside down, and I hope we can truly get justice for my brother. She thanks the prosecution team. So they're having an issue getting Anna Torres online, but they get her. Anna Victoria Torres is now on. The murder of our father has impacted in many ways. For the first year, I would wake up screaming, hoping I was having a nightmare, only to wake up, remember it all over again. My father is gone, and I will never be able to hear him say, "I love you" again. To know my siblings have been infected in such a way that are different after having a piece of their heart ripped away, all while her son gets to hear her voice and see her alive, is pathetic. Because of you, Sarah, my sister's heart is broken. My brother is left wondering when he will see his father again. The loss of my father has left me with chronic depression and anxiety. Seeing any fatherly love or kindness in real life or TV leaves me in shambles. Seeking therapy was needed to work without a breakdown. Thoughts of my father's demise enter my mind, and it makes me sick to think of his final moments. George Torres, not only my father, but my best friend, my personal comic, a creative and loving dad. He was human and deserved to be treated as such. My father, George Torres, was an incredible gem. Unfortunately, his light was dimmed on earth by evilness, but we will make his name live on. I hope you, Sarah, see his face at night. No more state impact statements, no more witnesses or evidence. So at this point, take a moment and think about who would be Sarah Boone's witness. If you haven't seen the trial yet, take a moment and think about who could be her witness. Who could Sarah bring at this point? And I want you to understand, it's going to be worse than whatever you imagine. Owens calls Diane Smith. Owens asks her to tell the court about her. She's a chaplain at the jail for 30 years. She met with Sarah Boone for 4 years. Sarah enrolled in a Christian program for a year. She wanted to change her life and loved to serve. She mothered other girls. She was Sarah's counselor, and other inmates spoke kindly of her, found her to be sincere and changed and helped people. Owens asked if the Bible was involved, and she says yes, spiritual growth. She would help girls wash their clothes, but she grew spiritually. So, chaplain from the jail is witness one, and they're pulling born again or revitalized Christian defense. Christina Penna, I believe is the name. She was in the jail with Sarah Boone. Same cell for 3 years. Now, the charges against Christina Penna were dismissed. Sarah is her best friend, who has helped her spiritually in growing. She would talk to me all the time and pick me up when I was down. And I want to make sure this is quoted. Mistakes happen. She would always help people in the dorm. She did art. She would pray with people and pray over people who did her wrong. Sarah is older than her. She thought of Sarah like a big sister. They helped each other with their cases. Back to the religion defense. Next is Mariella Hill. She met Sarah in jail, spent 3 months in jail. From April to June 2024. She had help on a form, and a CO directed her to Sarah Boone. She was helpful and kind, only good things to say. She has a deep faith in God. We are at the point, this person has known Sarah for 3 months in jail, helped her with a form, again, religion. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? I know what you're thinking. These are getting progressively worse. These are getting progressively worse, and that's fine. I understand they're getting worse, but I want you to really take a moment, take a step back. You might have to pause the video and prepare yourself because it is about to get so bad. It's another level, and I want you to understand something. As bad as this next witness is going to get, I'm pre-warning you, Sarah is worse. Next is Lana Albert, with technical difficulties. She's very loud and has no image. She lives in Minnesota and has end-stage renal disease. She is disabled. She's been friends with Sarah Boone for 11 months. They communicate with letters and through tablets. She gives condolences to all affected. Many articles and videos of Sarah have gone out on the airwaves and the webs. Opinions to be formed and commented on to the point it is hard to not treat people like a comic book or fictional. In the case of my friend Sarah, narcissist, Karen, villain, many other things roll off the tongue without thoughts of the humanity. She was one of those people, but becoming friends with Sarah has taught her there is more depth than what people see on the screen. Sarah Boone is a kind, honest, and good person. Sarah Boone loves animals, especially the kind that are damaged. She took in the blind dog and the deaf dog. She gives love to those who are hurt and damaged. Or does she get off, this is my opinion, does she get off on controlling them? That power. I think that's why she had the animals. I think that's why she stayed with George. She wanted to control him and she knew she could. She did. She recorded herself doing it. She fights harder for those she loves. Our friendship is an example. I couldn't appear in court because I can no longer walk after dialysis treatment. Sarah has distinguished herself as I share the state of my health. The moment Sarah learned of my struggles, Sarah offered to donate a kidney to me. Sarah Boone heard of this woman's situation and immediately sought to take advantage of it. Offered her a kidney, knowing she would never give it. She wanted a witness. She knew she needed someone on her side. And at this point, she knows no one's coming. Sarah Boone used this woman, a vulnerable woman, someone who's hurt and damaged, like the dogs, like what she turned George Torres into. She found a new victim in this woman, in my opinion. I hope she isn't mad at me saying this. She had no thought to personal gain, except, not life in prison, not a long sentence, not, if she thought maybe she'd get, shorten that plea at that point, or get a plea lower, who knows what she thought she could get out of this woman? Money? Probably not. Freedom? Yes. None of her friends have offered this woman a kidney. I don't have anything of equal value to give her, except a chance at freedom, right? They spoke after the verdict, and the thing that made Sarah emotionally break was realizing she couldn't be a donor to her anymore. Or Sarah Boone, who smiled still after the verdict, contacted this woman, broke down, and made sure she had her as a witness. She was broken up and couldn't help me. She is not remotely close to being a narcissist. She got you fooled, lady. Social media was worked to rip the blindfold off Lady Justice and take the sword out of her hand to assassinate Sarah's character. It says she starts talking about Psalm 85, and I'm not writing it out. I'm done with the religious crap, right? I'm done with it. No, saying you now read the Bible does not absolve you of anything ever. And it's a common tactic. Literally, what happens when someone gets caught doing a terrible crime on social media, a social media influencer every time? What do they immediately do? They grab a Bible. I'm so over it. The witness asks that your justice is mixed with mercy today. Next up is Dr. Harper. Doctor reviewed all the documents now. They go through all the documents she reviewed, way more than before. She interviewed Sarah's brother. Sarah Boone is the middle child, and parents had an unhappy marriage. After her being born, 11 months later, her brother was born, which caused her to be detached from her mother. Her father's death while Sarah was in high school was a turning point. Sarah used substances. The early lack of relations with her mom and death of her father messed with her foundation. She bonded to Mr. Boone early, so they're bringing in Brian Boone. She took on a parental role in that relationship and made decisions. So according to Dr. Harper, she controlled Brian Boone like a parent. That gave her a need to feel right and needed ego support. It was always, the ego support to always be right with Mr. Boone. This led to behavior she carried over to George Torres, where she took on a parental role. Oh, she's like a parent to George Torres, so I don't know, maybe comparisons like Casey Anthony are okay. She was physically abused. It is my opinion she called for help, but when people got tired of her not leaving, they stopped responding. So she handled things on her own. She stayed long after others would leave. Sarah saw students perform CPR on her father's dead body. This gave her a PTSD-style response combined with other instances. Is it still in existence and she needs treatment for it? She needs therapy. Owens mentions battered spouse syndrome. Dr. Harper explains battered spouse to the judge, who's heard it all before at this point, and he could probably quote it from memory, and I'm not typing it. You all know it. Owens asks about the downward departure filing, which we read. The doctor says she has PTSD, alcohol abuse disorder. Sarah needs treatment unrelated to the alcohol abuse disorder. She agrees it was an unsophisticated and isolated incident. Owens talks about the dismissed strangulation case, that it was one time she did something. We know that's a lie because there's so many videos and pictures and things showing injuries on George. She attacked George. She committed multiple crimes. Her destroying his private property is another crime. She had a history of crimes, constant history of crimes, that she herself recorded. And that's only the one she decided to save. What did Sarah Boone think was too far? Dr. Harper says the facts of that case were different. The state has questions for Dr. Harper. She did 9 interviews with Sarah. The state lists off things she reviewed and tested with Sarah Boone. She saw all the evidence, including a 74-page life story. Sarah had been Baker acted in the past. They asked where Sarah has been housed for the last 4 years. The jail. You admitted that you take advice and review records of other mental health professionals. Yeah. Have you reviewed any mental health records made by the Orange County Jail? No. The defense witness never once asked to see any mental health documents from the jail itself. She's unaware of any diagnosis that Sarah Boone has had since being in jail, since she hasn't reviewed those records, and James Owens confirms he didn't have her read those records. I'm sure you didn't, James. I wonder if those records from the jail would have helped Sarah. My answer is probably no, because if the answer is yes, why wouldn't you have her read them? James Owens lets Sarah know that he has submitted the letters to the court, and the judge tells Sarah he's read them. These letters are not in the record, but the judge has read them. Sarah wants to know how many. Of course, she wants to know how many fans she has. He has 6 written letters. He also has multiple emails. Sarah wanted to know this, to be clear. At this point, Sarah takes a stand. She says she has notes and has a written letter she wants to read from. This is actually an edited version. She wasn't sure what she should say or shouldn't say. She wants to read the important parts that aren't said during the actual trial. And at this point, I knew things were going to be bad. And on top of what she has on paper, this is just a tip of the iceberg, and then her apology is after her statement. And I wrote this in, I'm going to read this first. I'm going to play the audio and stop it periodically with commentary throughout, because I think the way she says it is very important. And I want the image behind me on purpose, so you can remember who Sarah Boone is during the statement. Keep in mind what this woman is. Let me get it here.
Kintu Sukuroi is a kind of Japanese ceramic style which means to repair with gold.
Yes, this is how she started. This is how Sarah Boone actually started reading her statement. This is what she wanted to read.
In this tradition, when a ceramic piece breaks, an artisan will fuse the pieces back together again using liquid gold or gold dust lacquer. So rather than being covered up, the breaks become more obvious and a brilliant new piece of art emerges from the brokenness. It embraces flaws, weakness, and imperfections, and also teaches the essence of resilience. Every crack in a ceramic piece is a part of its history, and each piece becomes more beautiful because it has been broken. This is the wisdom of Kintu Sukuroi. In my wisdom, and with all of my repairs, then, now, and ongoing, God is, has been, and will always be my artisan.
Sarah Boone, she's adding God into everything now, right? She begins with a definition, which she copied from somewhere, I'm sure, and now it's just bringing up God.
All of my gold is forgiveness. This has held me together, made me shine brighter, and overcome the damage caused by George Torres, the Torres family, the justice system, Orange County Corrections Department, social media, scoundrel detectives, infamy, defamation, ongoing constitutional rights violations, second-degree murder, forced into being pro se. Just as gold is very precious, forgiveness is invaluable.
Take that in. Take that in. She blames George Torres, me, technically, you as the viewer, anyone who comments on this video, in this chat, subscribes, hit the subscribe button. She's blaming you at this point. It's everyone but Sarah's fault.
Forgiveness is not an attempt to change or forget who, what, or how you've lived through to be so gold, but an act of grace, humility, and considerable self-compassion to be set free from sorrow. Withholding forgiveness denies your brilliance and adds even greater grief and deeper heartache, irreparable cracks on top of the already that no one deserves, no matter the pain or disappointment, untruths or injustice. It doesn't matter. As the more broken you are, even though now different than before, you've become more outstanding and more extraordinary. Above all,
she's become outstanding and extraordinary, everyone.
When you let go of blame, misunderstandings, excuses, give up your anger and cease from resentment, this is forgiven. And when you forgive, you have And when you forgive, you heal. And when you heal, you move forward. My goal begins with George Torres, and every time he slapped me, kicked, punched, spit on, raped, stabbed, choked, laughed at, pushed, pulled, dragged, whipped, tripped, stole from, lied, terrorized, threatened, humiliated, forced, degraded, made me cry.
Don't you like how laughing at her is just equally mixed in there? Almost like George's big problem to her was that she wasn't some sort of a parental god, right? She is the god in her mind. She is God. She views herself as a god. She took a life. Even now, even when she's trying to make George Torres sound terrible, which this is not going to help, she is guilty. She can't help herself. Just laughing at her is mixed in with all that other stuff, because any slight against Sarah Boone is akin to an act against God in her mind.
Every time he tried to end me, defeat, or destroy. I forgive George for
And I should mention, she does look at the family during this.
beating me senseless, for trying to sleep because I had to go to work or my son's field trip the next day, for ruining my deceased family's heirlooms, traditions, and keepsakes.
Now, we know Sarah has videos of herself waking George up. We know Sarah does not fucking work, right? Her work history is very sparse. And we know that she destroyed things that belonged to George and taunted him with it to bring him over to the property to get him arrested. And remember, those arrest records are being used by the defense. Oh.
My son's furniture, destroying the television we watched together. For
a television that, if you go back and watch, was not being used, had stickers all over it, probably didn't work, and when she recorded the video, it already had damage to the front, and George was talking about helping me clean this up, and it immediately makes me think, and I'm not alone, that Sarah Boone told him it'll be fun to smash it. We'll do it onto this, I think that's like a sheet or something put out there to pick up all the pieces, and we'll throw it away. And after it was already hit, she decided to film it, to edit it, to make herself look like a victim. Remember, we have the video of Sarah Boone upstairs, waking George up, harassing him. Every time he tries to go down the stairs, she keeps coming at him. And then eventually, when he turns around and says, yeah, call the police, you've recorded all of this, Sarah changes to her little girl voice, and George immediately, I believe, realized she's going to edit this video to cut out all the beginning parts and claim she's a victim to the police, because I think that's what she does. This is her supposed to be apologizing. She's supposed to be taking accountability for what she did for a downward departure at this point. And James Owens knows she's going to say this the whole time.
Wrecking our townhome by breaking windows, punching holes in the walls and doors, ramming his entire body into glass doors, kicking in my front and back door over and over and over. For breaking or removing the locks from all of the doors and sometimes the knobs altogether, so I had nowhere to feel safe, including the sacred space of my son's room where he beat me bloody on his bed. For terrorizing and threatening my blind and deaf dogs by leaving the gate open I built to keep them safe, telling me he hoped I'd find their bloated dead body in the pond or scrape their remains off of the pavement, for kicking them off of the bed and throwing across the room because they were trying to protect me. For threatening to make me unrecognizable to my son by breaking all of the bones in my face, like his brother Moses did to him after he kept seeing all of the bruises from George beating me.
Excuse me. From my understanding from the testimony, is that Sarah Boone basically set his brother up to attack him. Am I remembering that right? Let me know in the comments, wherever. If it's premiering over there, if it's not in the comments. Didn't Sarah Boone set him up for that? And now she's using that as a defense. Almost like this is all projection.
Like all of the times their father beat their mother. For all of the drunken rages and fist fights with so many neighbors when wandering into their apartments during hunting expeditions after I had escaped. For drowning me in liquor and wine because I didn't want to drink, causing me to urinate on myself.
George Torres is who made Sarah drink. George Torres is who made Sarah piss herself. maybe if you weren't downing a billion things of water in Dr. Pepper along with your wine, you weren't drinking your wine by the 1.5 liters. Sarah, of course, doesn't mention the fact, and she didn't mention the fact, that she went with George to Publix to get wine, and then George got more, and then also said George would go to save her the trip. She is literally blaming George for everything. George Torres, from my understanding, did not have these issues until he was with Sarah. Because it's easier to control someone.
Then butting the end of the bottle in my face, giving me 2 black eyes and a bloody nose. For making me experience what it is to be sodomized. Threatening to kill my friends and the neighbors when they checked on me to make sure I was alive and in one piece. For threatening to burn down our townhome and set my car on fire because I got a job. For holding me hostage on weekends my son was supposed to come over by keeping my keys around his neck, my phone in his crotch, and a butcher knife stuck in the middle of the table as a warning not to ask anything or try to leave.
Now notice, this stuff wasn't brought up in the trial. Why was that? Why wasn't this brought up? Did it not exist? Is this a creation of Sarah's mind after the fact? When she needed to make a statement here to the world. Remember, Sarah Boone knows I'm watching this and knows you're watching this. This is a message to everyone.
For stabbing me in the leg and not letting me call 911 for an ambulance or seek help, where I nearly bled to death until I concocted a lie to save him from being arrested. For destroying my phone with a hammer because my son called. For me experiencing ever being arrested and after today, prison.
Forever being arrested. She is angry. She got arrested for that strangulation still. You know, the one that she then kept getting George in legal trouble, holding that above his head to then coach him to get her out of trouble. An example of her calling the police is behind me. This is how she felt about having him put in jail for existing after she would basically, make him come over.
For beating me almost blind, crushing my occipital lobe. For having me experience what it means to see stars, like in the cartoons, where a character has a tall lump on their head. I had that too, and many times. For dragging me downstairs by my hair in the middle of the night just to sit next to him. For taking my car, driving drunk with my debit card to buy.
So, dragging down the stairs, again, I think she's trying to allude, at this point, to the whole, that the sound they heard was actually him doing that the day before. Remember that from the trial.
Buy more alcohol while I slept.
With no evidence.
Even after I cunningly explained the importance of my car to take my son to school foremost, me to work, and he to his batterers intervention classes and probation officer meetings.
Which, remember, the probation officer meetings, all that was to control him, and she bragged about it. And even after he's dead, she's like, I want to call his PO.
Where I would be forced to sit for hours in the parking lot waiting for him.
Why
For
work?
causing me so much trauma and pain.
Why would you have to sit for hours? Couldn't you just drive to a store?
Mentally, physically, emotionally, I had to be hospitalized more than once. For destroying my reputation and integrity. For my
She was Baker's acted. By the way. I don't know if that got mentioned yet. It will be mentioned.
For murderer Scarlet Letter. Not letting me feel safe to integrity. I had to be hospitalized more than once. For destroying my reputation and integrity. For my for murderer Scarlet Letter. Not letting me feel safe to live, talk to other people, spend time with my son, have a job, friendships, simply go to the bathroom with the door closed, or go to sleep soundly or comfortably. I forgive George for lying, for him trying in so many ways, so many times, to end me with his terrifying love. I also forgive the Torres family.
Forgive George for trying to end him with his terrifying love. Now she's going to go in on the family.
With his terrifying love. I also forgive the Torres family, his mother and father foremost, also his 2 ex-wives and daughters, all for knowing who George was capable of and has done in the past, his history of violence and where he learned it, than to keep turning a blind eye when I would ask for help. All of his siblings, including Farrell Torres, who is now on his way to prison for stabbing the mother of their baby in the side of her head.
So there's the brother story.
For everyone who knew what George was doing to me, sometimes how and when, but allowed and enabled. I forgive them for caring too late. I hope they all ask themselves while quiet and comfortable in bed at night the uneasy question, what could I have done to stop this from happening to both of them? And after all the time Sarah tried to, by asking for help.
Why won't George Torres' family, why don't they lay in bed and think about how they could have saved Sarah?
From all of us, and so many times. Another great contributor of my gold is social media, with its greed, insensitivity, deception, obvious exploitation, and advantageous gain from my criminal case as a whole, and for sentencing me by anticipation as a result of ignorance and hate, conjured and fabricated by the organized crime that is social media, which condemned me in the court of global public opinion.
Organized crime of social media. By the way, a jury of your peers found you guilty.
Since the beginning. My family law case is the new prey waiting to be picked apart and pillaged from me being made infamous by social media in my criminal case.
That would be the alimony case. She knows. She knows it's gonna be. It's either going to be made public in the future again, or people are going to talk about it. She knows we've talked about it. Where she wanted alimony and wanted a judge to force her son to like her. Those videos are out there. I have versions of it. Other people do too. She showed who she was in that, and people are really waiting for Brian Boone to not have to give her another dime officially.
It simply seems I cannot forgive and be forgiven and move forward.
No, you can't.
Social media has made me a pariah. It has caused great oppression.
Your murder that you committed made you a pariah.
And undeniable disadvantages, especially by broadcasting and manipulating my cases online. In my criminal case, as a result, my opportunities to be given a fair, proper, and uninfluenced, successful conclusion was heavily depleted and poisoned. I forgive them. Also, all of the media tycoons for not having a life of their own, trying so desperately to make themselves seem so right by making me appear so wrong. Forgiveness for prejudgment.
At least I'm forgiven by Sarah. By the way, I believe Lawyer was in the courtroom.
Ridiculous theatrics, lies, making and taking blood money from my and others' misfortunes, accidents, and catastrophes. It's all over their hands and their keyboards. And even after all that's been said and done, theorized, hypothesized, scrutinized, and blasphemed, in my case, still no one knows me.
We do, Sarah. We do.
In the end, I forgive myself for not choosing my life sooner, for not being more brave, vigilant, bolder, and outspoken.
I forgot how bad it was. How do I already forget how bad it was?
My life sooner, for not being more brave, vigilant, bolder, and outspoken, stronger, mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, for being hopeless, desperate, simple-minded, weak, and inexperienced. I forgive myself for not realizing I was enduring a life of domestic violence and that the vicious cycle of never ends. I had nothing to compare to. I've never been hit by a man ever before in my life.
You know what? I'm going to say something real controversial. If someone had hit Sarah Boone sooner, she is the type of person it might have helped. You know, she got too far up her own ass before she was ever knocked down. She lived a life where she's always right. She's always got things will always work out in Sarah's favor. She was not disadvantaged. She could get violence with a man. She could get violent with a man because she wouldn't be hit back. Brian Boone talked about Sarah being violent in their marriage. Sarah was taught that she can commit violence. Sarah was taught she can commit violence and be immune from consequences. She was never arrested for doing it against Brian Boone. If she was, we wouldn't be here today, most likely. If Brian Boone had responded, he might have gotten in legal trouble, but we might not be here today. And this is a situation where you never hit a woman. James Owens kept saying that to the jury. Sometimes you do. Because it's not hitting a woman, you shouldn't hit anyone. But there are situations where you should be defending yourself. And Sarah Boone is used to being in situations where she can be the aggressor. She can damage people, kill people even. She is the danger. But she wants to be treated special. Sarah Boone wants to make herself into this motherly figure, this parental figure. You wouldn't hit your parents. Try to get some extra sympathy there. But again, if you hear a teenager hits their parents, that sounds bad. You hear the parents are drunk and belligerent and hit their son and the son kicks the dad's ass, you don't care that happened. The situations matter. And that's really something I harped on before in a previous video. This attitude of you never hit a woman and I can't believe a man would hit her. If there is a situation, if there is ever a situation where you go, I think if there were a man, they'd be justified in hitting back, you have to think it the other way around. And not doing so is justifying the thought processes of people like Sarah Boone who will take advantage of that notion. Sarah Boone will take anything she can and use it. And she found out that violence was acceptable because she had a vagina. Put it as bluntly as possible, that is what Sarah Boone was taught. She was taught it at some point growing up. It was reinforced as an adult. And here we sit today. There's a history with Sarah Boone. Her side loves to talk about her past, but how much did she get away with? How much suffering did George Torres go through that was never made public? What didn't she record? Because what she did record was damning to herself, and that was painting herself in the best light. I can only hope her son was not a victim of her anger. I'll go back a little bit.
Mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. For being hopeless, desperate, simple-minded, weak, and inexperienced. I forgive myself for not realizing I was enduring a life of domestic violence and that the vicious cycle of never ends. I had nothing to compare to. I've never been hit by a man ever before in my life. I was raised hitting a woman was wrong and should never happen.
I forgot that was coming up. I'm sure you were raised that way, Sarah. I'm sure you were. And as I've said before, I think that's part of her problem.
No excuse. I forgive myself for not escaping permanently, for not fighting back sooner to save myself, my son.
I gotta replay that.
I had nothing to compare to. I've never been hit by a man ever before in my life. I was raised hitting a woman was wrong and should never happen. No excuse.
No excuse. Let me ask you a question. If George Torres was able to get out of that suitcase, if he was able to get out of that suitcase and Sarah was there, and let's say she had the bat in her hand, let's say she didn't. Hell, let's say Sarah Boone was upstairs and George Torres got out of that suitcase. If he went upstairs, with everything we know, how close he was to death, if he beat the shit out of her that night, would that be excusable to you? Because Sarah says no. Sarah Boone believes she can inflict any amount of violence or destruction or hate against a man and have immunity. Because that's what she was taught. This is what it made.
I forgive myself for not escaping permanently, for not fighting back sooner to save myself, my son, my dogs, home and car. Having 20/20 hindsight thinking of everything I could have done differently or better to avoid the outcome. I think about this every day since. Also, of all the good days we had together, for him at least, while I was constantly in hyperdrive, high alert, and paranoid, making sure I did everything right all the time. If not, the great possibility I would be ended as George threatened me with so many times before.
Or in the videos where George had to constantly placate her, couldn't listen to music. Just existing made her mad. She made him go for walks like a dog.
I forgive myself for falling in love with a monster, and no matter how grotesque he may become, I still loved him, hoped, and forgave. I tried breaking the spell so he wouldn't be a monster anymore. I saw who he was inside. George made me then, now, and always love him for all of his cracks also. We made each other our own brilliant pieces of art from the cracks and repairs. Unfortunately, not all cracks can be. In all of my forgiveness, George is my greatest lesson and will forever be a part of me. I think of him every day and still speak to him when alone on the rec yard. I ask his forgiveness and that he looks for me at the gates of heaven so I can tell him how sorry I am, endlessly, and that I never stopped loving him. In all of it and still. When I first came to jail, I put my mat under my bed and cried all day and all night for months, only falling asleep from being so exhausted with grief. I wrote him letters. I wrote his family and his daughters, apologizing for asking for their forgiveness. But due to fear that my life or sons would be jeopardized, I did not send. I am sorry. I cannot begin to fathom any of their grief and sadness.
It's always the fucking letters. She's staring at the family, by the way, during this.
Please forgive me. Almost everything reminds me of him, seeing my stab wound especially every day especially. It truly reminds me that all I really did live through. George haunts me. He is everywhere. I believe because I do still love him, think of him, and miss his laugh the most. In my heart, I know he is with me and understands that this tragedy was not intentional. I hope everyone can, his family foremost, miss his laugh the most. In my heart, I know he is with me and understands that this tragedy was not intentional. I hope
Attentional. How do you mess up the word intentional after using it so many times?
everyone can, his family foremost. I didn't mean for this to happen. Please wholeheartedly know that, and always, I would never. Forgive me, George. Forgive me, Torres family. Forgive me, Judge Cranick.
You just shit on his family and the judge and me because you're the victim. Hate this mentality.
To the entire planet, please forgive me.
I hate this mentality where someone gets called out for something, right? Like this is an extreme example, obviously. And immediately it's like, oh, I'm always at fault. I know it's all my fault. Like, you know, it just angers me. It's like, oh, poor me. It's like, yeah, you did it. Oh, yes, it's always my fault. I'm sure some of you can relate and know someone who argues that way, right? They have nothing to fall back on. So, oh, poor me. My life is so hard. It's been my fault my whole life. Like, that's not an excuse for anything. Especially when they, most of the time, in personal experience, they get caught in a lie. You ask them something, they tell you an answer, you prove it's a lie. Oh, it's always my fault. It's been my fault my whole life. Oh, just.
I graciously and humbly ask for consideration, for forgiveness to be extended instead of judgment, for reconciliation and restoration for all of us to move forward. My apology is profuse and ceaseless. Allow me, please, to brush off the muck, wipe the blood off of my face, and fix the cuts in my skin. I ask for understanding in what really happened and for how long. For second chances, repentance, and redemption, to advocate for all domestic violence survivors, to help them overcome, heal, and still hope, always, to make their voices heard, to confidently walk with all of their scars on the
Yes, Sarah Boone, the symbol of domestic violence victims.
outside and the inside, to help them not ever become a casualty of domestic violence as so many others, to stop the abuse and maltreatment before it's too late. There is always hope, and you can survive. In my soft-spoken conclusion, I ask this: would I be the darling mother, celebrated woman of the year?
Hold up. I didn't catch this before.
So many others, to stop the abuse and maltreatment before it's too late. There is always hope, and you can survive. In my soft-spoken conclusion, did Sarah Boone write herself a note to say this part soft-spoken and then read it out loud? I ask this: would I be the darling mother, celebrated woman of the year, if it were I who died?
No.
How many daughters, mothers, sisters, aunts, grandmothers, nieces, and friends have been because they did?
No, if George had gotten out while you were down there, if Sarah was down there during the time he had gotten out and he had killed her, he would have had a battered spouse defense. And they would have used her phone, just like they did in this trial, to show what she was.
I am a survivor.
If anything, what would have helped her look more like a victim was she wouldn't be there to do this.
Learn to do good, seek justice, rebuke oppressors, defend the fatherless, plead for the widow. Isaiah 1:17, all-encompassing, protect the abused.
Throw in the religion, Sarah.
Ms. Boone, is that the end of your written statement?
Yes.
Now, gathering your thoughts, did you want to make an oral statement?
I do.
All right, would you do that now?
So this is the part that's not written down.
Yes, please. My statement, my verbal statement, is primarily to the Torres family, to the judge, to his daughters. I know you all know who I really am, and that I did care for George, and that I do still love George. I know you know that we had very many good days, and I take offense to the statement of being said that this is just for a moment. Right now with me here in the courtroom in front of you all, this is just for a moment. But the moments before that, in order for me to be here, is endless. It's everlasting. The scars that I have on the inside.
He's trying to use George's daughter's statement against the family. In her oral...
My outside scars have healed, except for my stab wound.
There's like nothing to say. My stab wound, my stab wound, my stab wound. Aw, you have a scar. I'm sorry. You have, like, he's dead? How old is this scar on your leg? The only thing you have is a scar on your leg to argue about? I mean, you don't have any friends for witnesses.
But this has changed me as a person.
It gives you so much that you can tell Sarah has nothing when she has to repeat stab wound, right?
My scars have healed, except for my stab wound. But this has changed me as a person to see things differently and to understand things differently and to not be weak.
So what Sarah has learned through this is to not be weak, you know, being a murderer and being convicted of second-degree murder. And, you know, that's shown me that I'm too weak a person. I need to be stronger.
And just try to protect yourself and forever, regardless of the time that I may receive from today. I forever will have this experience. I forever will have George Torres with me in my heart, in my mind, my body, and my soul. As he and I used to say that we were one soul split into two bodies. This is not just for a moment. It may be for everyone in this courtroom, but when I leave, this is forever. When you all leave, that this is forever. This is forever.
So many people in all the chats and comments were like, make it forever, Judge. Make it forever, Judge. Make it forever, Judge.
For everyone here and those who it matters to most. I am one of those who will experience this forever. I'm sorry. Words do not define my shame, and I don't know what else it is that I can say and convey to the Torres family how this happened. The ifs and whys and how really don't matter. It happened, and I'm sorry. Words cannot describe. And I hope that everyone can forgive me, the Torres family most of all, and his daughters, because I know what he meant to them. And I don't think that anybody ever understood what he meant to me and I to him. And I ask for forgiveness.
After all of this.
Now, Ms. Boone, I have just one or two questions, if you don't mind. And you can speak on it if you want or not. But this is a unique case, and one of the reasons it's so unique is that you were in jail for 4.5 years prior to your trial. And I understand that when you were brought up as a child that you did have some spirituality in your family, some church, some religion.
Always.
But I understand that you got away from that. Did you have a chance during the 4.5 years to look back at your spirituality?
Absolutely. You know, everyone supposes that this is one of the worst experiences of my life, and it's actually been one of my greatest. If I were not beaten to death, I was going to work myself to death on the outside. And
This was one of her greatest experiences. She's going to work herself to death? She couldn't keep a job. George made all the money from a job. She just got alimony. She still wants that alimony.
I never had time to get back into my Bible and to pray and to be with the Lord. And I, being here incarcerated, have had time, of course, to get closer to God, to reacquaint myself to Him and realize what it's all about. This is all temporary. And when I say temporary, I don't mean by being set free in jail or from prison or wherever else. It means being set free and temporary, meaning that you work for something higher, you work for God, that you strive.
Sarah is going to start a cult in prison. I'm calling it now. She's going to start a cult in prison. She's going to have letters released or something, and she's going to try to become a cult figure, like a literal cult. I feel it.
Strive for your crown to be placed upon your head by Jesus Christ by being said, "You have done well, my good and faithful servant." I've always tried to be a good and faithful servant. I was just a servant as opposed to doing all that I can when my family were alive and I was going through everything up to this point. I've become so much more closer to the Lord, and it's made me such a better person, and I hope that I am an example going forward of the Lord's light and can draw many people to me because of it.
And draw many people to me because of it. Well, Sarah, you know what? I'll tell you what. In a lot of people's minds, you are a perfect encapsulation of the American Christian. I'll give you that, Sarah. I'll give it to you. Now, whether they want you to be that or not, that I don't think the Christian community will be very accepting. But hey, maybe you can get that cult following, right?
Any follow-up, State?
No, I assumed that was the final word.
Okay, so that is the last we're going to actually listen to the audio. I have more notes. Okay, State speaks now. State brings up the plea offer because Owen's going to bring it up. She was offered 15 years, but it's important that the entire plea offer be talked about. What was it encompassed? It was 15 years predicated on the defendant came to court and accepted responsibility. For her coming to court and her saying, I'm responsible for George Torres's death and I accept the punishment that comes with it. That consideration was never given in this case. So that offer of 15 years is in no way representative of what George Torres's life is worth. That was for a first-time defendant accepting responsibility and giving every benefit of the doubt. That was never met. Basically what they're saying is Sarah Boone still to this day has never accepted responsibility. Which you might remember was even part of the downward departure argument Owens was making. That's probably why Owens looked so mad. He knew this was going to happen. In this case, in this crime, she took the law into her own hands and she murdered George Torres. She has never shown any remorse for that. She didn't show it today. She painted herself as a victim of George Torres today. She's a victim of the George Torres family, a victim of the police, a victim of social media. Everything is about Sarah and about how Sarah is the victim. Sarah Boone sentenced all of Sarah Boone's victims to a life sentence. Just like she sentenced George Torres when he was in the suitcase. George Torres lived out his last nightmarish minutes in that suitcase, which undercuts any arguments that this was unsophisticated. There was ample opportunity to do something different, but she ensured he never got out of there while she went to sleep. She can't claim she was in duress for the same reason. She was in so much duress that she went to sleep for 11 hours. There is nothing from her testimony from Dr. Harper that established any diagnosis that would give this court a downward departure. Dr. Harper has put blinders on in that Sarah has been incarcerated for 58 months and the opportunity to get mental health treatment, and the expert witness is not curious about what those records would have said. There is no valid basis for a downward departure in this case. Sarah Boone deserves a life sentence. State is calling for life. James Owens is up. Thanks the judge for reviewing the letters. These cases are shades of gray. They don't occur in a vacuum. Generally, there's a history, especially involving a domestic couple. Much of what Sarah Boone testified to today probably happened behind closed doors. As we know, many times we do not know what happens behind closed doors between a man and a woman in their home, unless law enforcement gets involved. That happened in this case. There was a history of domestic violence involving these two parties. What we learned is that physically there was violence, there were photographs and experts in trial. Dr. Harper said Sarah Boone was a victim. The state's expert testified that Sarah Boone was a victim of intimate partner violence. She suffered from battered spouse syndrome at the hands of George Torres. There are two sides to it. In a situation like that, 95% of the women get out. There's a small percentage that stay. Sometimes a victim isn't a great historian. Sarah Boone is a unique individual with trauma. It is complicated, but the jury has spoken. You will now decide what is justice for Sarah Boone. To have some understanding of the unique situation Sarah Boone found herself in, this wasn't all behind closed doors. Some of it was in the public eye. Cases where George Torres was the perpetrator and Sarah Boone was the victim. They were dismissed. At some point, someone has to say stop and wait. The system failed Sarah Boone. I would ask you to consider that in the circumstances that led us here today. I would argue the system failed George Torres. James Owens mentions wanting a downward departure and the score sheet. The judge was provided a score sheet. James Owens misspeaks and says 20 months, and then the judge corrects him, and they say the lowest is 20.5 months prison, and the judge confirms. James Owens goes to the grounds for a lower departure, which we read at the start, tells the judge we heard testimony and asked him to consider it. Sarah suffers from mental health issues and specialized treatment. Sarah was under extreme duress. It was an isolated incident. One prior event had them both arrested. Remember, one incident where Sarah got arrested, and then she used that to manufacture multiple arrests of George to get him to then, on video, she coached him to get that case dropped. And other videos showed him with marks. Sarah was never convicted of a crime until this case. She didn't try to dispose of the body or the bat, unless that's what she wanted to do with Brian, and he wouldn't go for it. No attempts to delete the videos from her phone, and that shows it was unintentional. She didn't remember them because she was drunk. That doesn't make it not intentional. The Torres family is crying and shaking during this. Owens wants the prior 15-year offer to be taken into consideration. Judge Cranick gives his sentence. Sarah Boone will receive life. Sarah Boone received life in prison. George's family's crying and hugging. Sarah has 30 days to appeal the judgment. She'll be appointed an attorney. She has no questions. They explain that she'll get time served, like that doesn't matter. And that they'll become a civil case for anything she owes. James Owens is packing up and says he will mail something to Sarah. And she has a little smirk looking at the gallery. What a case. Very much sounds like this isn't the last we've heard of Sarah. She still views herself as a victim. I'm thinking cult leader. Gonna be honest, I think Sarah Boone wants to be a cult leader. Try to have a letter-based cult or some sort of a communication thing. I expect she's going to be making us read more letters, putting them on the docket if she can. Sarah Boone does not view herself as the perpetrator. She views herself as a victim of everyone. Everyone is victimizing Sarah Boone. She's the real victim in every scenario. Doesn't feel real that it's ending. And I also want to say how crazy it is that this is happening when there's an unrelated trend, hashtag I like my suitcase, online, with many videos including putting people inside of suitcases, which has got to be rough for the family. What a case. What a case. As I said, I don't, unless something else magically appears, this might be the last Sarah Boone video for a while. Maybe I'll cover something else, I don't know, with Sarah Boone in the future. There's a playlist with all the Sarah Boone stuff, and again, I might do a big mass video. I'm not sure yet. I want to thank everyone who tuned in just for Sarah Boone. I know I've done some other content, and understandably, not everyone's interested. Even the other murder content, a lot of people aren't interested. That's fine. Sarah Boone was a unique case, as James Owens likes to say. But if you do like the content, it would be awesome to hit 20,000 subscribers by the end of the year. But if not, I don't hit it. It's not that big a deal. This video went longer than I thought it would, but I wanted to make sure we heard Sarah. I went back and forth. I wrote out her testimony. But as it devolved, as Sarah Boone's testimony got worse, I wanted to make sure everyone heard it. The inflections she gave. And most of it, she didn't really look. If she looked more at the family or made more faces, I probably would have shown that. But I wanted the image behind me, because this is the Sarah Boone I want everyone to remember. The Sarah Boone who would manufacture situations to get George Torres arrested. Her victim. A man that she believed she could put her hands on, and she was taught could never strike back. A man she received felony strangulation charges for. She truly believes that that's okay to do that, because he can't hit her to prevent himself from being strangled. And she ended his life in that suitcase. And you know what? Sarah Boone believes she's justified. All her arguments of, I was afraid he would get out and hit me. She thought that would work because in her mind, there's never a situation where it would be justified to hit Sarah. In Sarah's mind, she could walk up to a random man on the street and punch him in the face, and he couldn't do anything back. That's what Sarah thought of herself. Not as a person, but almost like a higher being. She took her relationship. They tried to argue that with Brian Boone, she was the parent of Brian. She has to be above everyone. She can't just have dogs. She can't just have pets. She needs to have pets that she can personally have full dominion over. They can't see. They can't hear. Her talk of saying, well, George threatened he would leave the gate up, blah, blah. I bet in Sarah Boone's mind when she got that dog, both of them, she probably thought, you know what, without me, they'd die. And she probably fantasized about it as a power trip. Oh, if I didn't put this gate up, to think of all the bad things, I am their savior. That's how I view Sarah Boone. Now I see a couple directions we go from here with Sarah. I could see her committing crime in jail. I could see Sarah. She will be appointed a lawyer for the appeal of the sentence. I could see her wanting to do it pro se. The real problem was James Owens didn't make Sarah enough of a victim. And I really do think that if she can find a niche, she'll try to take some sort of a religious figure position. Her witnesses today were purely showing how manipulative she continues to be. She took a woman who can't walk and gave her the false hope of an organ transplant. Because that's the only way she could get someone to speak in her defense. Sarah Boone carefully did what she could to get herself witnesses. Put on a fake face. But remember the judge. If you haven't watched my video on the judge, I recommend it. He spent years in family divisions. He's seen Sarah Boone's before. And she got life. Sarah Boone got life. I don't know what else to say. It feels weird that it's over, but it isn't. It isn't. We've got an appeal of the sentence. We're going to have Sarah Boone trying some stuff probably in the future. I expect Sarah Boone to assault. I expect her to. I do. I expect Sarah Boone to assault an officer, a male officer at some point, and them hold her down, put handcuffs on her, and her be like, you can't hit a woman. Sarah Boone loves to complain about social media and videos, and she reveled in it, though. It's all she has. She doesn't have loved ones. I doubt her witnesses from today will speak to her in a week's time. A month, maybe. She doesn't need them anymore. She doesn't need to play pretend. And they'll see the real Sarah soon enough. No longer has any power over Brian Boone because his alimony's done. And the son is free. And the Torres family is free. She'll appeal the sentence and she'll fail. She'll try other appeals and fail. But they don't have to sit in a courtroom and hear Sarah blame them. I knew she'd blame George. Going in. She might even get racial with it. Well, she went for the whole family. You just know Sarah Boone heard about George's brother and thought, this is my chance. I'll make them all sound like a violent mob. Judge Kranick knew better. I'm going to end off the video. It's gotten long enough. It's going to take a bit to upload it. It feels surreal. And at the end of the day, Sarah Boone is, right now, she's not back to jail. She's waiting. She still views herself as the victim.